What if they never truly loved you, but only the part of themselves they saw reflected in your presence? It's a haunting thought, isn't it? That all those late-night talks, all those shared silences, might have been more about their need than your being. You didn't realize it at first, because you were giving, present. You thought love meant becoming what they needed. But one day you stepped back. No accusations, no screaming, just distance. And everything crumbles, not because you broke them, but because you stopped playing the role. And that's when the truth appears, not in words, but in the absence of you. Suddenly the silence becomes deafening. The space you left behind begins to speak. And what it reveals isn't your cruelty but their dependency. They didn't love you. They loved the stability you symbolized, the illusion you unknowingly upheld. You weren't just a person, you were the scaffolding holding together a fragile self. And now, with your absence, their mask begins to slip. Their illusion begins to crack. Not because you were wrong to leave, but because they never learned how to stand without leaning on you. They say love is about seeing someone as they truly are. But what if they never really saw you, not your essence, not your inner world, only a reflection of what they needed you to be? Carl Jung called it projection, the unconscious tendency to cast our inner world onto others. And in many relationships, you were not met as a person. You were received as a function. To them, you were the comforter, the protector, the one who made the storm inside them feel bearable. You didn't just walk into their life. You walked into their narrative. And slowly, quietly, they shaped you. Not with malice, but with need. They assigned you a role in their unfinished script. You became their emotional glue, their stability, their mirror, their meaning. But here's the quiet tragedy. You were never meant to hold all that. And when you finally stepped away, not to punish, but to breathe, they fell apart. Not because of who you are, but because of what you represented. You see, you weren't just a partner or a friend. You were the scaffolding, the emotional structure they leaned on to feel whole, to feel safe, to avoid facing the emptiness they never dared to confront. That's why your silence hurts more than a scream. Why does your distance trigger panic? Because you weren't just leaving. You were dissolving the illusion, the one where you were the healer, the steady hand, the reason their world stayed intact. But you are not a symbol. You are not anyone's unconscious lifeline. You are a soul, whole, breathing alive, not a role to be cast and controlled. And maybe now, they'll finally have to meet themselves, without the mask you unknowingly wore, without the mirror you always held up for them. And so it begins to unravel, not because you were cruel, but because you dared to step back, to breathe, to stop being the emotional life support they never learned to live without. What collapsed wasn't love, it was dependency. A dependency shaped not in adulthood, but long ago in the fragile world of childhood. John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth showed us something quietly devastating, that for some relationships aren't chosen, they're clung to. This is an anxious attachment, where love is not trust, it's tension. A relentless scanning of the room, the message, the silence, for signs of leaving. They don't want connection. They need it like oxygen in a collapsing room. You became that oxygen. Your reliability, your attention, your very presence was the balm that soothed their unhealed nervous system. And the moment you became less available even slightly, their body interpreted it as danger. Not metaphorical danger, primal danger. Because to the anxious mind, your absence is abandonment. Your silence is rejection. Your boundaries are betrayal. It doesn't matter how kind you are, how much you care, how gently you try to hold space. The anxious mind doesn't hear your voice. It hears the echo of someone who once disappeared. They panic, not because they lost you, but because they lost their anchor, the external regulator they leaned on to silence the chaos within. You didn't realize you had become that for them, but your predictability was their sedative, your presence a shield against their own inner storms. And when you changed, when you asked for space, or simply stopped performing the role, their world felt like it was ending. This isn't love, not the kind that sees and honors another. This is survival dressed as intimacy. And maybe that's the hardest truth to face, that their desperation isn't proof of how deeply they loved you, but of how much they feared being alone with themselves. They weren't holding on to you. They were holding on to the absence they never made peace with. And when that dependency is threatened, when the person they clung to steps away, a deeper wound is exposed. One that predates you. One that has nothing to do with love and everything to do with unfinished separation. Margaret Mahler called it forced birth. Not the moment a body is born, but the moment the psyche is ripped away from fusion. For some, that psychic birth never really happened. They grew, yes. They loved, they laughed, they attached, but they never truly individuated. So when you set boundaries, when you chose freedom, they didn't see it as an adult claiming space. They felt it as a child being abandoned all over again. Your autonomy wasn't just misunderstood, it was experienced as betrayal, as rejection, as emotional death. Because you were never just you to them. You were the mother that soothed, the partner that contained, the presence that kept the illusion of oneness alive. And when you walked away, you didn't just exit the room. You severed an invisible cord, one that had kept their identity tied to yours. They didn't cry for the relationship. They cried for the loss of self they never developed, the self that only existed in relation to your presence. That's why their pain felt so bottomless, so disproportionate. Because it wasn't adult grief, it was infantile terror, the panic of a psyche still fused with another, suddenly being asked to stand alone. And it couldn't, because it had never been taught how. This is the scream behind their silence, the rage behind their begging, the collapse behind their blame. They weren't angry because you hurt them. They were terrified because you reminded them that they never learned who they are without someone else to lean on. But here's the truth. You cannot be someone's identity. You cannot be their emotional ground, their mirror, their mother. Not without losing yourself in the process. Some bonds feel like love, but they're really symbiosis. And when you leave, what you rupture is not a relationship, but a delusion. And in that rupture, something sacred begins, not just for you, but maybe for them too. Because pain is not always a punishment. Sometimes it's the beginning of birth. And so the unraveling continues, not just of the bond, but of the illusion it quietly upheld. Because once the psychic umbilical cord is cut, what surfaces is not grief in its purest form. It's panic, anger, manipulation, a storm not of heartbreak, but of control breaking down. The rage you witnessed, the tears that turned to accusations they weren't proof of how deeply they loved you. They were proof of how tightly they held onto the structure you supported. You weren't their partner. You were their anchor. And when you let go, they didn't just lose a relationship. They lost their grip on stability. What they mourn isn't you. It's what you allowed them to avoid. Their own disorientation, their inability to self-regulate, their fear of their own emotional emptiness. This is the collapse, not of love, but of the illusion of control. You didn't break their heart, you broke the contract. The one you never agreed to, but silently upheld. I will hold your pain so you don't have to. I will be your mirror, your medic, your meaning. And when you stepped out of that role, not with cruelty, but with clarity, they called it betrayal. Because now, without you holding the architecture of their emotional world, everything feels like it's falling apart. But that collapse was always inevitable. Because no one can live forever inside a borrowed self. No one can keep another person standing if they refuse to learn how to stand alone. They weren't in love with your soul. They were in love with the relief your presence gave them, the predictability, the emotional shelter. And now that you've chosen truth over performance, their pain is real. But it is not your fault. It is the echo of their own refusal to face the part of themselves they once asked you to carry. And now they must either confront it or find someone else to fill the role. But you are done performing. And when control slips through their fingers, something darker often takes its place. Blame, condemnation, a rewriting of the story where you become the villain. You who simply asked to breathe. You who quietly stepped away from a role that was never yours. But to someone who relied on your presence to keep their inner world intact, your boundaries feel like betrayal. Your silence like punishment. Your detachment like cruelty. They say you're selfish, cold, distant, maybe even heartless. But those words, they were never truly aimed at you. They were aimed at the mirror you became, the one that reflected what they couldn't bear to see in themselves. Because when you stopped playing the rescuer, they had no choice but to confront the parts of themselves they spent years avoiding. And it's easier, far easier to attack the mirror than to look into it. Easier to call you broken than to face their own fragmentation. Easier to label you cruel than to reckon with the abandonment they've been carrying since before they met you. Carl Jung taught us that the shadow is everything within us that we have not yet faced. And when someone projects that shadow onto you, you become more than a person, you become a threat. Not to their safety, but to their illusion. You see, you didn't hurt them by being unkind. You hurt them by being real, by stepping out of the ideal, by choosing truth over performance, by holding up a mirror they weren't ready to see. And in that reflection, they saw their neediness, their avoidance, their unhealed wounds. But none of that is yours to fix. You are not the villain in this story. You are the mirror. And sometimes, the most healing thing you can do is to stop softening the reflection. Because real love doesn't fear the truth. It welcomes it. And maybe this is where the real shift begins. Because once the mirror stops softening the reflection, once you step back, not in anger, not in punishment, but in truth, something changes. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to walk away, not to cause pain, but to allow clarity, not to destroy, but to awaken. because your presence protected them from seeing what's been buried inside for years. But your absence, it does not protect. It reveals. It reveals the void they tried to fill with your attention. It reveals the fears they masked with your comfort. It reveals the part of themselves they handed to you, hoping you'd carry what they never learned to hold. And now, there's nowhere left to project. Now they're left alone, but not abandoned. Alone with the very feelings they tried to avoid. Alone with the mirror that no longer moves to protect their image. And it's in that aloneness something profound can happen. They may look inward. They may begin slowly, painfully, to confront the wounds you once absorbed. They may finally start the work that was always theirs. Or they may not. They may simply find someone else to take your place, another mirror, another symbol, another script. But that's not your responsibility anymore. Because in choosing yourself, you offered them something no performance ever could the opportunity to grow. Real growth begins where illusions end. And sometimes, your silence speaks louder than any explanation ever could. You didn't walk away to hurt them. You walked away to return to yourself. To come back to the place where you are not a symbol, not a savior, just you, whole, breathing, free. But freedom for some isn't inspiring. It's terrifying. Because when you choose autonomy, when you no longer play the role, you threaten the very illusion they've been surviving inside. Autonomy to the emotionally dependent feels like abandonment, not because you harmed them, but because you've exposed something they've tried so hard to keep hidden, the emptiness within. You were never truly seen, not in your complexity, not in your depth. You were used not with malice, but out of unconscious desperation. They weren't looking for you, they were looking for relief, for someone who could carry the parts of themselves they couldn't face. And you, with your empathy, your steadiness, your light became that person. You made the storm inside them quiet. You made the weight they refused to hold seem lighter. But they didn't love you. They loved what you made disappear. And so when you finally stepped away, when you chose space over sacrifice, truth over performance, you didn't just leave. You revealed. You revealed how much they had depended on your presence to avoid confronting the hollowness inside. You revealed that without you, they weren't sure who they were. You were their shield, their mask, their borrowed self. And now that you've reclaimed your freedom, they're left to face the mirror without a filter. Not everyone is ready for that. Some will call you cruel, others will cling harder. But know this, their reaction isn't about your character. It's about their illusion falling apart. Because your freedom doesn't destroy them. It only removes the story where they were never required to grow. You were the light they used to hide from their shadow. And now, with your light gone, the darkness speaks. But that's not your burden to carry anymore. There comes a moment when the weight of what you're carrying is no longer about love, but about survival. And it's not yours. You were never meant to be the place where someone else stores their sorrow. Never meant to be the permanent shelter for a storm they refuse to weather on their own. You are not a sedative, not a savior, not a steady hand for someone who won't learn to walk. You are a soul with your own path, your own wounds, your own unfolding. And yet they leaned again and again, not out of trust, but out of fear. Not to meet you, but to use you as a buffer against themselves. But you're not here to complete their story. You're not a missing piece in someone else's unfinished puzzle. You're here to live yours. To stay would be to betray that. To keep carrying the emotional weight they never claimed would be to abandon your own spine. So if you walked away, know this. You didn't fail them. You simply stopped pretending. Because sometimes the truth isn't something you say. It's something you become. And when words are no longer enough, when explanations fall short, when peace becomes performance, then yes, you tell the truth with your feet. And you walk, not to escape, not to punish, but to come home to yourself, to the truth that you were never meant to be someone's emotional crutch. You were meant to be whole. When you walk away and everything crumbles, I know this. They are not mourning you. They are mourning the illusion, the image, the dependency. You weren't just a presence, you were a function, a symbol of safety, a mirror they clung to because they couldn't yet face themselves. And when that mirror disappeared, the room went dark. But darkness isn't the end. It's the beginning of seeing. Your absence is not an act of cruelty. It is a sacred rupture, a quiet but necessary unraveling of a bond built not on truth, but on fear. Some will call you cold. Others will say you gave up. But only you know. You left to stop lying. You left to stop caring what was never yours. And in doing so, you gave both of you a chance to wake up, because the self cannot emerge in a role that was never meant to fit. And healing doesn't always begin in closeness sometimes. It begins in leaving. Comment below, I choose to be whole. Say it for yourself. Say it for the part of you that's tired of being a role. And if you're ready to keep walking this path inward, subscribe and step into the reflections that follow. Because once you awaken, there's no going back to sleep.